Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another conversation the Human Connection podcast. It kind of slipped from my head right there, but yeah, the Human Connection podcast and polyvagal conversations, and I'm so excited to be talking to Betsy Polatin today. And for those of you who do not know Betsy, you're missing a lot, I have to say. And let me give you a little bit about what Betsy's been doing for the last 40 plus years. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Been a
Yes.
while.
Yes. Betsy is an internationally recognized breathing and movement specialist. She has been teaching for more than 40 years and currently a master lecturer at Boston University College. And I'm the author of the Actor's Secret, right? And Humanual, which, from what it says, it's a manual to be human. And I have this next to me, and every time I open it up and I read a paragraph, and I'm just blown away with, oh wow, this is so cool. And let me sit and practice with it a little bit. So I'm really excited to have you here, Betsy, and see how the conversation today will unfold.
Great. Thank you so much, Manal, for inviting me to be part of your world there.
Yes.
Just one thing, I'm not at Boston University anymore.
Okay.
I left last year. I was teaching there for 25 years in the theater department, in the music department. And so I moved out of Boston and I now live in Los Angeles. So just for those who might look for me at BU, I'm not there anymore.
Go find her in Los Angeles.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, well, I want to start from something that I read in the book, and I go back to it over and over again, is your body is not a static object that you feel. You don't feel your body. You feel your current state of organization.
You are very clever and intuitive. That is probably one of the crux sentences of the whole book.
Yeah.
Because most people, most therapies, anywhere we look, in one way or another, interprets the body as some kind of object. And it even goes as far as, in some spiritual or religious practices, like the body, like don't even think of the body's a nothing, and I disagree. And when we treat the body as an object, then we tend to have this separation, and that separation comes into the rest of our lives also, because then other people become objects too. And that's not really where the new age is coming to. We're coming to, hopefully, joining together a bit more, even though we don't have to talk about this, but the world is kind of split apart right now, but some of us are working on a different idea.
Yes.
Yeah. And so getting back to the phrase that if you think of your body as a static object, you lose a kind of connection to yourself. And when you realize that, quite frankly, I don't often use the word body by itself. For me, it's always body, mind, self. And you have so much more insight into yourself when you recognize that you're not an object. I mean, the old-fashioned cartoon figure was this, I think of like Walt Disney, for those who grew up in America or have that idea of a little person in your brain saying, oh, do this, do this, do this,
Yeah.
and we're not that.
No, we're not that at all. What fascinates me also, what brought me a lot of insight is the word that your current state of organization, because I've been, coaching through embodiment, but it always also says like, okay, my body, what my body feels, and there's sometimes a generalization of what my body feels, and it feels like this all the time. But that phrase brings me back to current, now, how my body is now.
Yes, the present moment, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And if you kind of hook it up, people say, oh, my body's tense.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're rushing. And if you look at that, you can't really rush without being tense.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't, people try to get rid of I need to get rid of the tension, that kind of thing. And it's like, if you're doing a certain something, you're going to be tensing yourself.
Yes.
So if you can understand, oh, right now I'm rushing, then do I need to rush here? And if I do, tensing my muscles a little more often goes along with that pattern. So I don't have to try to get rid of my tense muscles.
Yeah. So it's simply knowing what I need right now and what it would be appropriate to use. And because that's usually when, the word relaxation comes in or calm comes in. It's not always good to be relaxed, really.
Right.
And and it's not always good to be calm.
Right.
And from my own personal experience, sometimes calm is more of a freeze state than a calm.
That's true too. Also, and from my perspective, often when people talk about relaxing,
Mm.
it's a collapse. And that's a shutdown state.
Yeah.
Yes. So how do we genuinely be in ourselves and be in a more calm, or you say relaxed state? Doesn't necessarily have to look like this collapse, or as you say, the kind of freeze state.
Right. It looks calm and I'm going with emotions, but it looks calm. It looks like I'm on top of my things, but and everything, but that's completely cut off. And
Right, because inside is just going a mile a minute or fired up.
okay. With being disconnected from the body and from the feeling, from or our feelings, sensations, and everything, it feels like it's something that in the world that we live in has to happen for some people at some time to be able to do the things that we want to be doing. So, for so many different people who, a surgeon who'd be standing for 12 hours doing something, cutting himself off from that sensation of hunger, thirst, whatever is a necessity. And it goes to many levels.
Right.
So how do you see that? Are we also kind of not supposed to, but is it doable that we all become these kind of feeling connected whole being? It's lovely to think of, but in reality, I always
Right.
think about that, and I wonder, how do you see it?
Right. Well, I think we have to go back to, almost always our early years. And so many of us had a childhood environment that was less than ideal, right? So when that difficult environment is hitting us, then we know from polyvagal that the system can only take so much difficulty or overwhelm. So in order to not feel that overwhelm, we kind of cut here and just like stuff it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that becomes normal,
Yeah.
for most people. So that's, it brings to mind Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So like you say, that surgeon who's standing in Hungary, whatever, we say, oh, that's normal. Isn't he wonderful? He's doing these wonderful stuff.
Yeah.
And on another level, if we think of his own well-being, it's like he's not listening to what he needs. He should be taking care of himself, and maybe surgery should be rotating between two people or something. Maybe the world should be different, maybe. So I think there's a lot to what you're saying, in that most of us do have the pattern of doing some version of that because it was necessary.
Yes.
And when it is necessary, it's a good thing that we did that, because the system would you've got a container and you put a ball in it and another ball. So at a certain point, they can't take anymore. So they're going to, be flying out. So it's important for each person to recognize, what their window of tolerance or their threshold is. And it's also a decision of, how do I want to live my life?
Yeah.
Do I want to be that surgeon who stands on their feet for 18 hours and doesn't pay attention to themselves, and, they recover? Once, it's not a problem. Twice, it's not a problem. Every day for 10 years, maybe it starts to be a problem. We don't know,
Yeah.
I mean, we do know it does get to be a problem.
And that's why I was, asking that question, because at some point someone told me, well, not all of us need to be connected and all that. Is that realistic? And it was very hard to argue with that, but it all comes at a cost, and everyone needs to decide, this is the price, or this is the cost that I'm willing to give to be able to do this and that.
Exactly. And when you do that, you really need to look at the long picture, because like I said, with the surgeon, he can do that for a couple of years and he's fine. But then when he's 60 and 70 and his hands start to shake or whatever, it's not great.
Yeah, you mentioned Myth of Normal, and I know you worked a lot with trauma, and I'm curious of how do you see that affecting life, for a person's life, that kind of stored, unresolved, living with trauma. And usually it tends to kind of be a vicious cycle, and we could also take it to generational trauma.
Yeah.
And let me ask you first, how do you define trauma?
At a very simple level, something overwhelming happened and nobody was there to help you. I think that's a really big piece of it, that nobody was there. Because something difficult happens and somebody's there, it can be a very different experience than something difficult happening and you can't manage it and nobody's there to help you. It's like, whatever your response is in that moment, it can get caught. And to continue your other questions, that often is unrecognized. It's like, I often joke, it's not really a joke, that I work with people who have trauma who don't know that they have trauma, you know? So it's like, one time I was working with this young woman. She was an actor and she was doing a monologue. And then in the middle of it, she said, I always like to hold my head in a certain position. And I said, that's odd. Your head can move in, lots of positions. I said, is there any particular reason for that? She said, no, my childhood was fine and nothing ever happened. So I said, okay. And then a few minutes later, she said, wait a minute. When I was younger, I was swimming in the ocean and a wave hit me. And I said, that.
Ah.
So in that moment, she was, young. The wave was big and it surprised her and hit her and shocked her and stayed there. And part of her still thinks she's in that moment of that wave hitting her. Yet she went on with life because, probably first of all, she didn't even tell anybody. And if she did, most parents would say like, oh, you're fine. There's nothing wrong, nothing obviously wrong with you. So you must be fine and get on with life and stop whining about getting hit by a wave or whatever. You know what I mean? And yet this pattern gets deeply lodged. And so she goes on with life not feeling that. And then she does something like acting, where you have to, or you become other people, and other people move in different ways than the way that you move. And so your patterns are going to show up. That's one of the things I do with actors, is show them their habitual patterns so that they can take on another character's patterns. So in that moment, when I pointed that out to her, she said like, oh, oh, oh. And it just undid. And she said, oh, my head feels like it's bobbing around now. And I said, yeah. And there it was.
Yeah.
So again, she didn't know she had trauma. And I don't want to say it like this, it wasn't a big deal. I mean, she just took care. It was in the moment.
Look from the outside as what we normally view as trauma.
Right, right. But it was going to interfere with her life.
Yeah.
So it is trauma in that way, it affects her moving forward.
That's fascinating. There's so many things that are fascinating with that story. I think for me, one of the most is how the body remembers. It's like, asking is like, just trying to think is like, anything happened? No, nothing. But then at some point, the body brings that image, or that, no, something actually happened.
Yes.
And that's what it is.
Nobody asked before.
Yeah.
And I asked in that moment. And so you're right. The system got to show what was going on, or say, well, that did happen,
Because you mentioned you're working with actor, and that's something we talked about with Maddie in another conversation, Mattie Shisco,
yes,
about Yes, about that different, taking on sort of a different nervous system, the role, the person, the whole
Yes.
human that you're taking the role of, and how does that affect the actor's own nervous system?
Well, I'm going to take it a little more into the physicality to start
Okay.
with.
Yeah.
It's like if I see somebody in the distance
Mm.
and they move a certain way, I think like, oh, that's Harry. That's how Harry walks.
Mm.
And so as far as being an actor goes, that's that's not great because you want to be able to walk. You want to know that that's how Harry walks.
Yeah.
And then before you take on a character, you want to understand what your either walking pattern or nervous system pattern is. You want to know what yours is
Mm.
so that you can change it to be someone else,
Okay.
either, the walk or the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
So, because otherwise you see actors still in their own pattern, and then they kind of lay on top this other person. And for me, as an audience, I usually don't believe it.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
don't believe it because it's something like, huh, what? It's not clear,
Yeah.
But those of us who are being ourselves, we're very clear about who we are and what we do. But when you mix it up, so that's why whenever I work with actors, I help them, or musicians also, help them really understand what their patterned, habitual patterns are, their own, before it's like they want to become more of a neutral blank slate,
Mm.
then take on somebody else's nervous system or walk, and if you get one, you tend to, get more.
Yeah. And that's again looking and sensing our physicality, our body, how much understanding, looking at the patterns helped me personally. I'll speak about myself, understand myself more. Like, there's
Oh,
things that I had no idea that I'm doing, or it was not clear. But when I'm walking a certain way, when I'm like being kind of I see a rolfer and she used the sack of potato on the ground walking. It's like that feels very different when walking, and I want to get to the feet and standing and the support that comes, but watching my patterns helped me understand myself far quicker than if I sat down and I kind of tried to analyze it, analyze myself from a thinking perspective. Like,
right.
this is what I do, and going through that, just noticing what I'm doing with anything.
Right. Yeah, what I think what you're talking about is what they call bottom up, right?
Yeah.
It means bottom up means paying attention to what's happening in the physicality
Mm.
first and then sorting it out psychologically. Whereas a lot of therapies are what we call top down, and
Mm.
that's sort of figuring it out here and then hopefully or maybe reaching what goes on there.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something that it makes a lot of sense, that I read it this morning in your book. It says emotions are preceded by bodily sensation, and we go on to say once we notice the sensation, it's easier, or we can catch it, or we could process it and deal with it
Yeah.
uh, quicker. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because that was like, oh yeah, that is, it makes
Yes.
sense, and it should.
Right.
It's how we should do. Work with emotions all the time.
Right. Right. I mean, we can use the example of somebody who cries a lot, you
Mm.
know, and they decide, this is really uncomfortable in public. I don't want to cry a lot. And if you just try to, I'm not going to cry, I'm not going to cry, it's like that'll have a certain effect, but it's not the depth that we're really looking for. So what you want to do is pay attention to what is the physical sensation that happens right before you cry. And, it's often a kind of pull down or heaviness or closing somehow. And if you start to notice that and work with the physical sensation of it, then the outcome can be a bit different. But just, willpower kind of stopping something is often not that effective.
Now, well, when you're talking, what comes to mind is with children, when sometimes something, child misbehavior or whatever we call misbehavior is, we're looking at what happened at the end or the tantrum. However, that has already been, started kind of brewing long before that big tantrum happened, and we usually miss those cues of like that are very small. But if we had looked at it and kind of worked it out or attended to it,
yeah,
then we don't have to deal with the bigger tantrum.
And we know, because now we understand the vagus nerve, that 80% of the fibers go from the body to the mind or the brain, and only 20% go from here to there. So that has to tell us that we should be listening to this. It reminds me many, many years ago when I was teaching mostly Alexander technique, I had somebody come for a session, and basically we got him to move in a little bit of a different way, move into more ease and fluidity. And the next little while, he told me that they stopped smoking cigarettes. And I was like, oh, that wasn't even what we were trying to do, But it's like this configuration of my body wants a cigarette.
Oh.
This one doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's really, there's so much more to this than any of us know. But I love the discovery of it.
Yeah. Well, I had a question. I usually don't write a lot of questions when I'm doing but because I've been reading the book, so there's a lot of kind of thoughts and questions, and I was going to leave this to the end of the conversation, but I'll go ahead of, because you mentioned that there's more to discover, and you've been working with different bodies, different things for the last 40 years. What kind of, maybe surprise is not the exact right word, but what do you see, like every time that you're working with someone, what surprises you about the human kind of organization or in working with humans?
Well, I think one thing that I'm noticing now is that the world is really changing now. And I don't know that much about it, but even astrologically, the planets are astronomically, there's this thing called solar flares, forces coming from the sun, and there's more input to us from the galaxies, so to speak. And so I think that's already different. So there's a whole different opportunity for us to respond in different ways. And I think that the honoring, like everybody comes with whatever their life story is, right? The biography affects the biology, right? And vice, it's like that's all there. And what's beautiful, surprising, miraculous is that it can change.
Mm.
And I think that's what excites me about this work, is that there's this potential in everybody. There's nobody's too far gone, so to speak, in my work, in my experience, or my belief, that if you can figure out a way, there's a way in. If the person wants to change or wants something different in their life, and not everybody does, and that's fine.
Yeah. But what I hear you saying is the ability to see that in others, no matter what the facade is, what the actions are, is to see that there is something we all have, no matter where
Yeah.
we are, no matter what our bringing is, and that is essentially, good. And
Yes, I think that there's, again, this is my belief, that there is an internal organization that, like you say, is for well-being, for good, that is part of the evolutionary process that goes on. And that's, I say we're geared for well-being because, if you get a cut, your system heals itself. That says something. That says that healing is available. But if you, this is awful, if you put your hand in dirt or something, it needs certain conditions to heal.
Yeah. And yes, that's one of the things, as we have the capacity, but we need the environment, we need this. And I again love what how you define trauma as, like, no one was there. So is the environment, there is the other, someone who would take your hand, and I think it's the validation of, like, oh, you are good, you could do it. There's, we say, like, there's hope of that. I think that's one of the things that we essentially need, is someone who would recognize that no matter how terrible our actions are, that we're still worthy of,
Right.
insight.
Right. And I would say that it's recognizing that the potential is there. Yeah, the potential is there for each of us. And again, if we take it, we take it. We don't,
I'm in my head now, there's like so many different branches of questions I want to ask you, and I'm aware coming tonight, but I think you talk about the expanded self a lot. Yes. In the book, and you kind of you have the expanded self versus the adapted self. Can you say a little bit more about, we know that, at least I'm assuming we all know the adapted self, the things usually we know about ourselves, but can you say more about the expanded self? How do you see it?
Yeah. And again, like you say, I think the expanded self is always there. And what we're just looking at how we interfere with it. And so that those interferences are like, show up like the person with the wave, you know, all of those are interferences to moving forward in life, thriving, doing something that brings you some kind of satisfaction and joy, you know, and being able to speak a bit more from your authenticity. And the behavior is, this is a difficult one, but less, you know, trying for the attachment. If, you know, if somebody says, let's go for coffee, and I've got stuff to do, I really don't want to go, but I say yes anyway to attach, to make this person like me or be with me, but it's not going to be fun anyway because I don't really want to be there. You know, we're just reinforcing that instead of standing in my expanded self and saying, you know, thank you, but I really have a lot to do. I'd love to get to know you better, but I have a lot to do today. And so the expanded self shows up in so many different ways. And it can show up in ways that are not physically expanded. Because if I grow up in a household with a parent that's screaming and raging or something like that, then I would probably be better off making myself a little smaller to sort of stay out of shooting range, so to speak. So in that moment, the expanded self is the wisdom. But again, that wisdom is always there. And I think the more we can take that in, and that's why I talk a lot about the idea of support.
Mhm.
Because I think in terms of what we're talking about, the expanded self, is that if I don't know that I'm supported, then I'm going to be holding myself up. And yet, if I realize that I'm supported, I'm on the ground is supporting me, then it's like, oh, I don't really need to hold myself up. I'm on the ground and I'm just here. It's a very different experience.
Um, it is, and when you said, you know, the wisdom is always there, I feel comforted. I'm like, oh, okay, so, you know, it's for me, it's nice and comforting. That's the word that I could think of. Like, oh yeah, there is the wisdom. I don't have to do it on my own.
Exactly. And that's such a, I think it's a very Western thought, right? I mean,
I think it is, yes.
yeah, ego, me, I'm going to do it. And, you know,
Independence in terms of I could do it all by myself.
right.
And the super woman and the super mom comes to mind as like, I could do everything and I don't need anyone. I think, yeah,
And we
it's
know,
exhausting. It's an
eh,
exhausting.
we know it's not sustainable.
No, it's not sustainable. And I always go back to, that's one of the things that stays with me all the time. When you talk about support of the ground, it's like
Right.
how nice when I become aware of it and like, oh, the ground is supporting me. And I've been going to a rolfing practitioner, and I'm working also on the feet of like almost bouncing off of not, you know, this kind of a light walk. And it became a practice for the last few months. As my rolfer suggests, is like, as soon as I wake up in the morning, I just take, you know, just put my feet on the ground and just feel it. And sometimes it takes a minute.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that is
Yeah.
so lovely.
It's interesting. That's one of the first exercises in Humanual
Oh
is,
really?
yeah, when you wake up, when you as you get out of bed, take a moment to let your feet
Yeah.
on the ground, because it really changes your day.
Oh wow. That is that is fascinating in how much we selectively, I think, sometimes see things or not see things because
True.
but it has really changed my
Right.
relation with the ground and my feet of like,
Yeah.
and how nice is to feel supported really by
Right.
the ground.
Right.
Um,
Yes. And it's a reality. I mean, we live in a gravitational field.
mm,
The force of gravity is coming this way. The earth is spinning, gives off a centrifugal force. Something's coming up this way. And gravity, anti-gravity, we meet the planet and move in our life. With this interaction is a very important place. And it's very real. That's what I'm saying. It's not like made up or woo-woo. It's like we genuinely are on the planet.
yeah.
I don't know many people who can do something and not be touching somehow, some yogis, yes, but for most of us,
Yeah.
something is in touch with the planet,
Yeah.
and that's information for us.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's why support is such a big part. And I know you talk about support, suspension, and breath, and they're
Yeah,
all unfortunately we don't have time. I was thinking it's like, okay, we're going to talk about breath for a good amount of time of this conversation, but something else came up. But I do recommend people who are watching or listening, you have a lot of YouTube videos about the breath, and there's a lot of
yeah, yes,
exercises that
yes,
really are, I find them very simple.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because if they're not simple, who's going to do them,
Yeah, yeah, and I don't know. Sometimes some people think that to solve a complicated or something kind of complex, we need complex
Right,
solution. And what I'm seeing, especially when it's related, to the body and our nervous system, the simplest solutions usually
right,
work the best.
yeah. So with that, when you feel the support, or when I feel support that comes up through me, there's that slight expansion, which is the suspension. And as soon as I have that, that starts that process of breath.
Mm.
So I feel the support coming up through me and the breath. And the more we can pay attention to ourselves in that way, I think it's suitable to who we are.
Well, let me ask you this last question, Betsy. What is kind of your learning edge, or what are you right now, if you are right now learning as you go? Because my assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's no stop to like, okay, I got it all. I know
Right. No.
everything.
Yeah, I don't think I got it all. Let's put it that way. I think I'm thinking more directly these days about two things, and one is the changes on the planet. I'm definitely thinking that there is more awakening consciousness available on the planet now. I think that's very real, and I'm very interested in that. And also related to that, I think a bit more about I've always thought about it, but more about the fascia, the connective tissue, which is this oneness of elasticity. Like I say, we're wearing an elastic suit. I mean, I've said that for years. It's not new, but I think the elasticity, wholeness, oneness of us and the oneness of the universe, that's just more and more for me. I hope that made sense.
Oh, it made sense. So yeah, it's and I'm quite fascinated because I'm wearing this t-shirt, and it looks like to me
It
stars,
does.
and it looks to me like tissues as well. But that visual that I got of like looking at the fascia and looking at the sky and the galaxy kind of has a very similar kind of
Yeah.
expanding. It's like, oh, it's we can
Yeah, and I don't know anybody else that's talking about that like I am now. So I think that's interesting too. I'm sort of cutting edge there.
Oh, lovely. It's fascinating how many dots or so we find to connect until we see everything is connected. It's all the same. And I love in Humanuel when you put different pictures about, you know, the spirals and you know, and there's so many out there about how we in our human tissues resemble kind of similarities with, you know, plants, animals, you know, the world. It's to me, it's absurd not to know that we're connected.
Right. I agree with you. It is absurd, but some people live in that world. So,
Yes, and I try to be as non-judgmental and compassionate as I can
right.
possibly can. But I think to me, the polyvagal theory have helped me a lot with that.
Yes.
And
Yes.
what we know now about trauma is that, you know, yeah, with someone who's living in survival and they have almost no kind of ventral, or it just like, yeah, it's for me, it's much easier to understand.
Right. Right. Yes.
Mm,
Which is, it's enables us to come from a place of compassion
yeah.
for ourselves and others.
Yes. Well, it's a beautiful note to end with. Anything else you'd like to add about how people can reach you or um, any of
Yeah,
that?
I think that humanual.com is my website. And on the website, there's a link with an email for information or my newsletter updates. But I really want to thank you for inviting me. This has been
Oh,
a enriching conversation and
oh,
enjoyable.
it's
So,
it's it's my honor, Betsy. I think I absolutely love your work, and I love your presence and your genuine kind of human interrelation, which is honestly, it's such a lovely thing to find and relate to, especially with someone who like you've been working for 40 years in a kind of an institution on your own, to be honest. Yeah.
yeah, it's true. It's true. But thank
Thank
you. I appreciate it.
thank you so much, Betsy.
Thank you. Take care.